My name's Lemon. Welcome to my office. This is the place where I have been for something like 7 months, in my pajama pants, with beer. But I want to talk to you about making websites, because making websites is a thing that I enjoy. It's a thing that I continue to do, and it's a thing that I believe a lot of you do as well. And there's a lot of interesting stuff to talk about here, so let's talk about the different languages that are involved in making websites. For example, I write in Pug a lot. I don't know, this seems to be a kind of a rare language. You don't see it that much, but it's an HTML sort of similar to Haml. I like it. I think it's neat. Another one is Sass. This one's obviously a very popular language, but sort of a CSS precompiler, sort of algorithmic kind of thing. Neat, also like it. Another one that I enjoy is Vue. That was a particular liking that I had. It was something that I looked at the three of them, and Vue was the one that spoke the most to me. I thought it was the one that spoke to me personally and the one that I chose to write in. And before that, I wrote in Ember. I still do some writing in Ember. I do think it's still actually a decent language, for sure. There's a lot of cool stuff in Ember. And you shouldn't really look it by, but sometimes I do end up writing stuff in .NET. Now, .NET is never my choice, personally. I'm never the one pushing for that particular thing because I specialize more front end. But if the back end people tell me, we're going to put this thing in .NET, then awesome, no problem. Let's whip together some C#. We can totally do that. I can do some Razor. Let's make it happen. That sounds totally fine. It's a little bit more of my druthers and sort of like my tech stack. I end up going PHP, usually because I'm trying to put together some sort of CMS. There's a lot of really great PHP CMSs out there, so I do write a fair amount of PHP. Some Laravel, some Twig, whatever. I do write a little bit, not as much as I used to, but a little bit of Bourbon. Bourbon is the idea of sort of CSS mix-ins, styles that you continue to use. And so when I'm writing, sometimes I do reach for Bourbon. Sometimes I do reach for Bourbon. Sometimes I reach for beer, and sometimes I'm just drinking gin. But all of these languages, except for the last two that I just made up, are actually examples of three immutable texts. These are three technologies that will exist on basically every website, no matter what. And those three technologies are HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. Whatever you write, you're going to come down to these three things. It does not matter. You're going to have these technologies. You can maybe pass on the JavaScript, and some people do sometimes. It's a little bit less likely to see somebody pass on the CSS. But we're going to talk about specifically the CSS, because I think that is not a true statement. No, I do not think CSS is easy. I will never, ever tell somebody that CSS is easy, and I do not accept that CSS is easy. In fact, Dave Rupert, who knows quite a bit about CSS, says CSS is easy. It's just a few thousand key value pairs with quirks in each browser that you have to memorize. And that's pretty much the case. That is a lot of what CSS is. But the other thing that CSS is CSS is great. It is a great language. It's a real programming language. It's an interesting and evolving programming language. And it's a programming language that I'm going to talk to you about for a little while. Okay, so if you're thinking about CSS, and maybe, you looked at the title of this talk or whatever, and you came into this and you said, well, CSS to me is like this. And I see this GIF a lot. I still see this GIF a lot. It's an old GIF, but still one that resonates with people, and I get it. I understand. I understand the mentality that makes people make this GIF and the mentality that makes people laugh at this GIF. I get it. But I think about CSS a little bit more like this, as something that, once you actually harness and understand, becomes a cool thing that's also GIFable. So I'm going to take you through today's agenda. Today's agenda is going to be in three parts. We're going to talk about things that are weird, because this is CSS. Things are weird in CSS. Yes, they certainly are. We're then going to move on to things that are great in CSS. I believe this is equally true. Things are great in CSS. There are great things. And finally, we're going to have things that you can try now. I don't want to just have you learn a couple academic things or maybe some sort of buzzwords, and then you go like, blah, blah, blah. We got stuff that we can actually start off with right now at the end of this talk, or, at the end of this day. There's other talks as well. But with that said, let's get weird. All right, hocus pocus by focus, we're going to get weird, and one of the ways that we're going to get weird right away is with the topic of overflow. And with the topic of overflow, there's actually an image you also might be familiar with, an image you probably have seen before, and it's this one right here. You've seen this before, and maybe some of you even have this mug. And again, I get it, but when I looked at that a couple of times, I started to think, well, let's see, okay, let's try to make this image in CSS. It's definitely easy to do. We're going to start off with our box. We're going to say our div box. CSS is awesome, cool, great, awesome. Now we're going to go ahead and write our CSS. First of all, we need our border. We're going to measure our border in an EM. If you're not familiar with that concept, an EM is basically a letter. So one EM is about the size of a capital letter M, more or less. Changes with the font, but one is about a letter. All right. So then our width is going to be 4 EM, so 4 letters. And our padding, we're going to give a little bit of padding so that this thing doesn't just crash into the border. And, there we are. There we are. And that's basically, it looks a little bit different than the example that I gave you here, but it's basically there. And I've seen a lot of different versions of this on different Redbubbles and stuff like that. So we're basically there. And now that we have it there, let's talk about, well, okay, how do we fix this? How do we fix this weird CSS problem? Well, there's one way to fix it, and it's with overflow hidden. Very straightforward way, one little line of code, overflow hidden. We give this thing overflow hidden, and that says that a box is a box, and a box is going to contain the box. Nothing is allowed to go outside of the box, and that simple value says CSS is awesome. We probably know what it meant, but this is not really the image that we're looking for, right? We're missing the text. We will never see those last letters. This is not the right approach. Our overflow hidden, which is not the default value, didn't do what we wanted to. Okay, so let's move on. We could say overflow y hidden. We say overflow y hidden, and this is the y-axis, right? When we say overflow y hidden, we're then saying by default, well, that means that overflow x is auto. So if you've got the room to just go ahead and to type out those letters, then go ahead and do it. If you don't, then I want you to give that thing a scroll bar. So we say overflow y hidden, so overflow x would be then auto, and that gives us this. Now, okay, so we solved a concern, right? A concern was solved in our particular design. Our letters were invisible, now they are technically visible, but that's not awesome UX. That's definitely not something that I would ever ship to prod. So, okay, let's keep moving. Word break, break word. When I say to you that CSS is weird sometimes, this is exactly the kind of thing that I'm talking about. Word break, break word is the way that you actually write this text. And the CSS working group actually admitted in a blog post, they said, here's some mistakes that we made along the way. We made a lot of rules. We made a lot of rules. Some of those rules were dumb. And one of those specific rules that we had, word break, break word. That's awful syntax, awful syntax. But what's actually saying here, word break, break word, is you're saying, okay, so if there happens to be a word that's too long, go ahead and break that word. It's a weird way to state that rule, but there's the rule. And so if we do that, word break, break word, we end up with CSS is awesome. Okay, again, we are getting better. We are getting better. This is pretty much what we're looking for. Maybe that could have had a hyphen in it or whatever. We don't really have a box, and that's not awesome. So, but we're getting better. We're getting better. Okay, so let's go text overflow ellipsis. Okay, text overflow ellipsis is actually something that you see with some regularity in modern CSS. The way that I see this the most commonly is in a large table. You'll see one of those tables with like 14 columns on a website. It needs to be responsive, and so what they do is they say text overflow ellipsis to say, like, if this text just happens to be too long, go ahead and ellipsis this thing out. Kind of like the news blurb where it's just like ellipsis, read more. So if we do that specific thing, then we end up with CSS is on. CSS is on. We were getting better. I feel like we're getting a little worse. I feel like we're getting a little off track of trying to solve this particular problem. So let's just go ahead and go back into these rules. Let's look at these rules and let's see what's going on here. Okay, so our border. We know we need to have a border because we know we need to define a box, right? And we also need to have a padding because we need to say, well, now that I have a line, I don't want you to actually, ram the letters into the line. That wouldn't be good. But then we have our explicit width, right? We're saying that we've got a width of basically 4 letters, and then we're saying, and I'm going to give you a word that has more than 4 letters. This then points out the problem that this is not really a CSS mistake, this is a design mistake. Because with this many letters and this font size and this box size and all of these design specifications the browser has, that's supposed to be the result. What else could it possibly be? Could it shrink down the letters? Well, no, you didn't say to shrink down the letters. It definitely could, but you didn't say to do that. This is a design problem. If we get rid of that with 4em, then we end up with this. CSS is awesome. And honestly, I do think that it is. I got the idea for this part of the talk. Brendan Smith's blog on CSS tricks. Great website. Been going since 2007. Still a really good resource for CSS information. But I want to move on to position as another weird thing that exists inside of CSS. And when I talk about position, I'm going to talk about these 4 values, right? These are 4 values that you might have for a div, for a p, for an article, for a whatever. Relative, absolute, fixed, and sticky. And all of those work differently, and all of those have different interesting rules. And none of those are what you get when you just write a div. If you write a div, you're actually writing this. Position static. Position static is a div without any other rules applied to it. This is the default value. It's a little bit like relative, but it's also a little bit worse. And I'm going to explain why. So we look at all 5 values. I've got a fixed, I've got a sticky, I've got a relative, blah, blah, blah. And I can go ahead and scroll this thing. I can see that my relative and my sticky elements pretty much move in sync. My absolute, which is this blue guy over here, positioned a little bit differently, so he's going to move differently. Our fix is going to stay on the screen, but our sticky is actually going to scroll until it hits the top and continue to go. Some people don't know about sticky still, and that's okay, but it is an actually valuable property to know about. So going through these things, a fixed position element would be, it's stapled to a fixed position on your screen. If I say left 200, top 200, that's going to be 200 left and 200 top on your screen, and that's it. It's going to move no matter, or it's not going to move no matter what. If your VP says to you, whenever somebody comes to the website, what I want you to do is I want you to put up a big modal that says, like, sign up, put your email in. First of all, don't do that. Say no. Say no to your VP. That's a terrible idea 100% of the time. But, you know, if he breaks you, then you need to be doing it with position fixed. Absolute is when it's positioned to its nearest restrictive element. So, you know, a little, like, X close button that you might have in a little box. That's it. A lot of times that's going to be an absolute positioned. Sticky is a sort of new element type, or a new position type, and it's going to start off as relative and then turn into fixed when it hits a certain rule point. Kind of neat. Relative is the thing that you're thinking about when you're thinking about an element on the page. When you're thinking about an image or a div or a paragraph or whatever, relative is the thing you're thinking about. And static, in some cases, is the thing that it is. The differences between the two are basically the properties that they don't accept. For example, if you ever had the situation where you've had 2 different divs and you've tried to lay those over and you want this one to be on top of this one, and you went like, okay, well, z-index 9. No. Z-index 999. No. Z-index 9999999999999. God damn it! If you've had that particular problem, and I know that I have, it's actually probably not the z-index being overwritten, it's that you have a static element, and that static element is going to ignore your z-index rules. Similarly, if you want to give something a top or a bottom attribute, you know, 5 pixels from the top, 5 pixels from the left, or whatever, static will ignore those rules. It does not pay attention to those rules. Also, it will not hold an absolute element. So if you have a div and then you have an absolute element inside of it, and you want to make the absolute element relative to its container, static will let it bust out. Okay, so then the question that you might have with this particular idea is, well, why does static position even exist? And the reason why it exists is that it does. It's a tautology in CSS that you need to kind of accept, right? There's the idea with languages like, you know, Java that you'll have an idea of a breaking change, and something will come into the spec and there'll be a breaking change, and it's like, well, as long as you're using this version of the software, then you can no longer have this property. CSS will never have that ability. It's an additive language. Things can be added. things can totally be added, and things that are in preview can be changed around. But once something is actually in the spec, it's in the spec. Position static will remain in the CSS spec forever because it is. Some of those tautologies, break word, is going to stay inside of the spec, even though it might not be the best. There's obviously things that you can do about this. One of them would be this particular idea. We can say, well, okay, instead of that, I'm going to say here, every element that exists, I want you to go ahead and just make every one of those elements position relative. You totally can do this. I do not recommend it, simply because you might end up accidentally breaking things. Instead, what I would actually recommend is that if you're having that issue, that something is being weird, before you do anything else, tell that element to be position relative. And sometimes it's going to actually fix what you're looking for. I have a Codepen article on that if you'd like to read more. But I'm going to move on to float. Okay? That's not what float looks like for me. That's not what float looks like for me. Float actually, for me, it looks like this. That's what I think about when I think about the property of float. And I'm going to talk about the one layout that exists in float. The only one reason why float exists. And if I've got this particular markup, then what I want is something to look like this. This is when float works. This is an example of float working good. We've got our image of Tina. We've got our text that we want to wrap around the image. And that's an example of float working good. That's still the reason why you would want to use float, and the only reason why you would want to use float. But even in that particular case, it can still look weird, because when float doesn't work, it actually works like this. This is the exact same kind of markup. The only difference is that my image is taller than the actual text. And so when this bit of text, this paragraph here is done, it goes, well, okay, I'm done. And the article tag says, well, then I'm done too. And then Tina Belcher just hangs out, looking awkward, which is her thing. Why does this happen? Well, we don't need to talk about why this has happened. What we need to talk about is, can you fix it? Yes, we can fix it. We can fix it like we fix so many problems in CSS. We can fix it with hacks. And what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, so after this element, we're going to make a table, an invisible table, and it's going to clear left and right floats. And in so doing, we're going to make this happen. And why does that work? Well, and the reason why that works is that if you imagine right at the end of that paragraph there's a table, a hypothetical hypercube, time cube, it's in your mind kind of table that exists without any value, but it does clear elements to the left and right of it. And the fact that it does clear these elements means that the article can go on unbroken. And now that we've got that solved, let's just make a layout with floats. I mean, we can do this. Facebook's done it. Twitter's done it. Let's just make a layout with floats. And if we're going to talk about content that we would want for a layout, it's pretty easy. It's just pictures of William T. Riker with quotes from William T. Riker right underneath them. That's what the internet looks like to you, right? I feel like that's what the internet looks like to me. So we've got this particular layout. You know, this is not weird. This is definitely an expected kind of concept. And let's just go ahead and build this thing with floats. We know what clears look like. So we're going to say, okay, so Riker, we're going to say, we're going to float that thing to the left. We're going to calculate that thing to 33% minus 30 pixels because, in fact, computers can do math. I know, it's crazy. You can actually do math inside of CSS, and it works most of the time. We're going to give some margin to the left and the right to make that thing work. And then we've got something that looks bad. That looks very bad. That looks really, really bad. And if I had more time with you, Connect.Tech, could explain a little bit of why that works and how we could get through that. And we could go to those kind of nuts and bolts. But with the time we have, instead, I'm just going to show you the hope. The hope that is in Grid. CSS Grid is a spec that is in the browser you're watching right now. It's in the browsers that you've used, and it's really, really good. It's something to be excited about because we're going to do that Riker layout. So step one, we're going to say all Rikers, display that in the grid. We've got our columns. I'm not going to get into that. And then we've got our gap between our columns. And so now that we've defined that, step two is, we're actually done. We're done. We've got some prettiness to do with the actual background and foreground and that sort of thing. But our layout is done. That is actually 3 lines that just makes that layout work. It's one of the cool things about this thing. And in fact, when I wanted to show you the way that we wanted the grid to look, I first just did that in grid because it was the fastest way, and that is 288 bytes for the grid entirely. And that magic of that works in grid template columns. There's also grid template rows, which basically works the exact same, but there's a lot of different ways to measure this thing. I'm going to go through, again, we've only got a certain amount of time, so I'm going to go through these things as quickly as I can, but in so doing, I actually want to talk to you about my gin and tonic. Now, I'm not a master mixologist, I'm just a fan of drinks. And my gin and tonic, the way that I make it is I put in 4 ice cubes, I put in 1 jigger of gin, I put in tonic water, and a lime wheel. That third step, that tonic water, that's whatever is available, depending on the glass. I'm not special about glasses. I just put in the amount of tonic water that's appropriate to fill up the rest of the glass. And there's a huge piece of that in CSS Grid. For example, we can say grid template columns 1FR, 1FR. 1FR in this case means a fraction, but it basically means one of whatever you've got available, right? And whatever you've got available in this case is that, right? So we didn't specify some sort of pixels. We just said two of whatever you've got, minus the actual gaps and all this other stuff, and the margins and stuff like that. It'll totally take that and just say the amount that you've got available, work with that. Cool, cool, awesome. We can also do that where we've got a shorthand syntax, and we can say repeat 4 1FR, just saying repeat 4 of the same amount, and then we got that. Sure, not exciting? Not exciting. There's more exciting things, because we've got the idea of repeat columns 200 pixels, 1FR, 1FR. Now in this case, we're talking about mixed measurements, right? One's in pixels, because we care about the actual pixel count, and then one's in fractions, because like once you've got those 200 pixels, do whatever you like. And in this case, we've got this, right? Our first element here is going to be a short drink, and then our second element is going to be a longer drink. This is the kind of thing that you'd be using if you were doing like a CSS like sidebar or something like that. We can get cooler than that, because we've got the idea of autofill. Now in this particular case, I'm going to say, I want you to go ahead, and I'm not going to tell you how many columns, because I don't know how many columns you've got. All I know is that I know that a column should be 240 pixels, and that's it. So autofill whatever you got with 240 pixels. And the browser will do that. With that line of code, the browser will just do that, which is neat. But then you look at the layout and you go, well, cool, except for obviously like this is a little bit of a miss. And of course it is. It intentionally is, because we didn't have 240 pixels available, so it just moved on to the next thing. But we can actually fill in that gap, because we can say repeat autofill min-max 250 1FR. In this case, we're now saying, okay, fill up this space, and I'm going to give you a minimum value and a maximum value. And my maximum value in this case is like, again, whatever you got. All I know is that a column has to be a minimum of 250 pixels. And that said, I want you to just fill this thing up, and it will do that. The neat thing about this specific idea is that this line of code does not have any breakpoints. So if I bring this into a new window, right, and I just start moving this thing around, that 250 pixel more or less value is actually going to fill the screen. I don't have breakpoints in here. I just have that line of code, and that's able to make a responsive layout without me having to do a bunch of overthinking of that thing. But we can get even fancier than that, because with this layout that we have, there's actually more fanciness to have. Okay, so I'm going to say I want you to take a grid template column of repeat 4 1FR, and then I'm thinking about rum drinks, right? So in these rum drinks, I want that to take up a span of 2 of whatever this column looks like, a row of whatever this column looks like, or whatever those rows look like. And I want you to go ahead and do that thing, and it will just do that thing. When you're looking at this layout, if you were going to do this in basically any other way, and honestly with any other technology that at least I can think of, you're going to need to make a bunch of special rules and a bunch of special parenting and the idea of like parent-parent-child sort of relationships. But in this case, all of our things are actually in a direct row. These are all direct siblings of each other. The only thing we've said is that the rum drinks, we want to span 2 columns and 2 rows. And it did that. It changed that layout dynamically like that. which is a cool thing that Grid can do. Another cool thing that Grid can do is let's look at those glasses, right? So we've got our layout, and again, these are all direct siblings of each other. There's nothing special about them. But now let's just sort these things by glass type. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, a Collins glass, I want you to order that first. A Martini glass, order that second. A tulip, let's order that third. A margarita glass, you go ahead and order that thing fourth. That bit of code will actually make this. And that concept would require so much JavaScript to get to that same element. Our DOM hasn't changed. Our HTML has not changed and does not need to change. We can have the same markup anyway, and we can just change around orders of stuff with single lines of CSS, which is really, really, really cool. And I can't imagine that anything is Okay, this is the part of the front-end talk where the speaker says something negative about Internet Explorer, and I'm not going to even do that because we know what Internet Explorer is. We know what it does to our lives. Let's move past it. Let's just look at the numbers. Those numbers aren't the best, but actually if we look at those relative to use, and if we look at that as an actual slice of the average American visitor, it actually looks like this. At this point, we're not talking about Internet Explorer at this point, because like this bit of Internet Explorer over there on the way left, we can handle that. The only thing that's actually even a bigger slice of this is really, really old Chrome. And by the way, that is really old Chrome. I'm not really sure what made that Chrome so old and how something could be a web browser and not get updated for that long. But that's actually what our slice looks like, that and Opera Mini. Our takeaways here are that if we want support for IE 10 and 11, we actually can do that. You can get some support. You're going to need prefixing. You're going to need testing. You're definitely going to need testing, but you can get there. You're not going to get Internet Explorer 9 minus, but you're going to actually probably want to write special style sheets for them either anyway. And any other lacking is basically a browser that's more than 3 years old. I'm looking at that clock, and I'm going to skip past Flexbox for a second, even though I think Flexbox is really, really, really cool, and even though I think that as a discipline, both Flexbox and CSS Grid should be used together. But I do recognize that we've only got half an hour together, Connect.Tech. And the other thing that I wanted to talk to you about was the cascade. When people talk about CSS and JavaScript, and they talk about, well, this way you can get the concept of priority in JavaScript, I think in a lot of cases those people have missed out on the cascade. That C in CSS stands for cascade. They're rules that overwrite each other. That's kind of the point. In fact, that is the point. That's how you're supposed to be writing this. And there's cheat sheets and there's guides and there's whatever, but here's what I put together when I try to think about the cascade. The cascade is individual rules calculated in order of increasing specificity, with IDs getting extreme priority, only beat by inline styles, and important being the nuclear options. So essentially, a rule is a rule, and the more specific that rule is, the more likely that rule is to win. IDs are going to win most of the battles, because IDs get a lot of priority. And if you do something where you say style equals color red, then that's going to beat the ID rule. And the only way to get out of that is to just bang important on the end. And by the way, if you're doing that specific thing, if you're handling somebody's code, the only thing that I would recommend is create a file called shame.css. Anytime you have to write CSS that feels gross, that feels bad, that you don't actually like to do, put it in a file, because it will happen. It happens to me. It totally happens to me all the time. The only thing that I do is, recognizing that a deadline needs to be done, I'm going to write that code, but I'm going to put that in a file to go, this isn't okay. And this is not what the software needs to look like throughout time. And if we've got that in shame.css, we can get back to it. But with that idea, we've got this, and we've got this. And those rules end up conflicting with each other. Take a moment. But the result of these specific rules are this. And if you don't know why, then the solution for knowing why is actually in the browser itself. I want you to take a piece of CSS that's weird to you and just open that up in your browser of choice, whatever it might be, and find out why these rules are losing from each other, because the browser is going to tell you. If you inspect any element, you're going to get every rule that affected that element, and the rules that got beat are going to be crossed out. The browser is going to explain to you why that rule got beat. In talking about specificity, and this is now what me trying to impart a little bit of what you can do with this information. In talking about specificity, I want to talk about CSS Diner. Google it. It's by Flukeout, and it's really, really good. If you're talking about trying to, it's a really, really sort of phone app kind of game to just make and select objects, and it works really well. And I think that this particular thing, even for me, and again, I've been working in CSS for quite a while, helps me learn a lot about how to write queries for just the elements that I'm looking for. Flexbox Froggy, again, I did not get the chance to talk about Flexbox, but it is really rad. And Flexbox Froggy, it's a very simple game where you're just trying to get these frogs on their lily pads, and you're going to do it by just writing CSS rules in the browser. And once you write the correct CSS rules in the browser, your frog's on the lily pad. It's not going to take long. It's going to take about 25 minutes of your time, and you're going to actually know a lot about Flexbox by the end of it. Similarly, the very same guy, Thomas Chase Park, did Grid Garden. Sort of the same concept. The only difference here is now that you need to water some vegetables, and you're going to be watering those vegetables by writing a CSS grid. Very, very helpful. Cool. And also Codepen. Codepen is a website that just allows you to, I'm going to just click on this link, which is just going to bring me to CSS-only pens. And that's going to be showing me stuff that people did only in CSS, right? And the cool thing about this, like any other GitHub repo, is I can actually just look at the source code and go, well, how did you get there? And maybe I screw with the rules in order to make it, try to figure out how those rules, oh, that was the bottom left that I played with there. But Codepen is a really neat experience for that particular thing. No, we don't need to save that. And just in case you happen to love CSS as much as I do, I would encourage you to do CSS Battle. It is code golf specifically for CSS. If you like to write code that's technically correct, but also completely illegitimate, if you want to write just bastard code, specifically just to do less keystrokes, CSS Battle is a really neat way to do that. And I'm hoping by the end of this, maybe you started off thinking about CSS a little bit like this, but maybe now you can think that CSS is useful, and it's cool, and it's surprising, and it's beautiful. Because I think it is. These CSS GIFs were done by Lynn Fisher. You should check her out, Lynn and Tonic on Twitter. And that's my time. My name's Lemon. ahoylemon.xyz is the site you can find me on. And if y'all are into stickers, contact me one way or the other, and I will send you some of these. Thanks, Connect.Tech. Bye-bye.